When Lucas Hargrove appeared at the reception desk of a medical facility in Kingman in early spring, he was barely recognizable, gaunt, hair and beard matted together, clothes hanging loosely and flapping on his emaciated body, and eyes filled with panic, as if they still hadn't left some dark place. The diver, who had gone missing 5 months earlier at Lake Mead, the one presumed dead, but the most terrifying thing wasn't his wretched appearance. The most terrifying thing was what Lucas implied about those 5 months, about the place where he had been held, about the reason he wasn't allowed to disappear, and about the things that are still lying undisturbed beneath the water where he once dove. Some names and details have been changed to protect identities and privacy. Before diving into the story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the latest cases. On the early morning of a late fall day, the area along Lake Mead appeared in its characteristic stillness, the flat water reflecting the pale light of the desert sky, while the dry cliffs and the rugged gravel-strewn access points showed almost no signs of the usual crowds of tourists, when Lucas Hargrove, 41 years old, a civilian diver living in Boulder City, finished his final preparations for his personal dive. According to those who knew him, Lucas was very familiar with the lake, having completed dozens of solo dives over the years, and treated equipment checks and underwater terrain surveys as part of his professional routine rather than a risky activity. That morning, he wasn't on any hired job or official project. He simply told his family he would do a short dive near the lake, at a less frequented access point, where the depth changed quickly and was often chosen by experienced divers for practice. Lucas was last seen carrying his familiar dive gear, with the air tank thoroughly checked, and heading down to the water's edge in weather that seemed stable. Though anyone in the profession knows that Lake Mead always harbors unpredictable risks such as sudden cold currents, visibility limited by silt, and unmarked submerged structures. According to the plan they had agreed on beforehand, Lucas was expected to return to the meeting point within a specific time frame, just enough to reassure his family that this was only a short dive and wouldn't take long. Time passed, and when the appointed hour came and went with no sign of Lucas, the delay was initially explained as a familiar situation in the trade. Maybe equipment needed adjustment, or he wanted to finish up a remaining part of the dive. However, as more hours passed in complete silence, no phone calls, no replies to messages, anxiety began to spread through the family. By the time afternoon drew to a close, and the light started fading over the lake, the assumptions of safety no longer held, because such prolonged loss of contact completely contradicted the careful habits Lucas had maintained for many years. His family quickly went to the lakeside area where he had planned to dive, but found no clear evidence that Lucas had returned to shore or left by personal vehicle. His absence, combined with no notification of delay, no note left behind, and no witnesses seeing him leave the area, turned what seemed like a normal personal morning dive into a serious and unusual situation. In a state of growing worry and tension, Lucas's family had no choice but to contact local authorities to report him missing, officially marking the moment when a routine dive at Lake Mead became a disappearance of unknown cause, beginning the chain of uncertainty that engulfed his loved ones from those very first hours. Right after the missing person report for Lucas Hargrove was received, local authorities coordinated with regional search and rescue teams to quickly launch a large-scale search operation around the shores of Lake Mead, focusing on access points where a diver might enter the water, and on areas where currents, terrain, or professional habits could cause a victim to drift or make their way back to shore. Ground patrol teams were deployed along gravel beaches, low cliffs, lakeside trails, and sparsely used parking areas, checking every vehicle left overnight, every tire track, and any items that might have been abandoned in an emergency situation. At the same time, professional dive teams were dispatched to conduct underwater searches in the area where Lucas was believed to have dived, using side-scan sonar equipment to detect unusual objects on the lake bottom, and to mark points for direct diver inspection. This effort was supported by experienced divers, accustomed to cold water and low visibility, people familiar with navigating among submerged structures, such as old concrete blocks, metal debris and remnants left behind before the lake was formed. In addition to official personnel, Local volunteer groups also joined the support effort, including residents knowledgeable about the terrain, recreational divers, and individuals who had spent considerable time in the lake area, providing information on hazardous spots, underwater currents, and seasonal water level changes that could affect the search range. However, right from the start of the operation, the lake's unique challenges quickly became major obstacles. Low water levels exposed sharp rock fields and slippery steep slopes, making shore access dangerous, while underwater, thick silt layers and temperature differences between depth layers reduced visibility to just a few feet, forcing divers to proceed slowly and limit their working time for safety. Even modern sonar equipment struggled to distinguish between long submerged structures and potential new targets, resulting in many suspicious points having to be manually checked, only to confirm they were familiar objects already documented long before. Throughout the search period, no body was ever found, and no evidence emerged, suggesting any kind of altercation on shore. No blood trails, drag marks, discarded personal items, or vehicles abandoned in unusual condition were recorded at the access points. The gear typically associated with Lucas's diving activities was not found scattered around the area, so the theory of a violent incident right at the lakeside had no basis to be prioritized. In the absence of direct clues, authorities maintained the initial hypothesis that Lucas had likely suffered an accident during the dive, a scenario not uncommon in the deep lake environment, with its many hidden dangers, where equipment failure, disorientation due to poor visibility, or a sudden physiological reaction could put even an experienced diver in a life-threatening situation in just a matter of minutes. The fact that Lucas was diving alone further reinforced this hypothesis, since there was no dive buddy present to assist, monitor, or confirm what happened underwater, meaning all assessments had to rely on environmental conditions and the general experience of the profession. Internal meetings were held regularly to reassess the search area, considering whether to expand or narrow the scope based on sonar data and dive team reports, but every adjustment had to contend with limits on resources and safety concerns for the participating personnel. Lucas's family was kept fully informed about the progress and results of the search operation, including the use of available technical assets, the coverage of priority zones, and the fact that no specific evidence had been found, indicating he had surfaced at a different point or been seen leaving the area by personal vehicle. This information was presented carefully, emphasizing that the lack of findings did not equate to a definitive conclusion, while at the same time reflecting the reality that the initial efforts, despite their scale and seriousness, had not yet produced a clear answer. As time passed, the intensity of the search had to be adjusted according to natural conditions and the ability to sustain personnel, leaving Lucas's family in a state of heavy waiting, where hope and anxiety coexisted in the context of a disappearance in which every initial sign pointed toward an accident hypothesis, yet no concrete physical evidence existed to confirm it conclusively. After all search efforts lasting many weeks yielded no definitive results, the authorities were forced to make the decision to terminate the official search operation around the Lake Mead area, a decision not made in haste, but after a series of internal evaluation meetings where every possible approach, every area, and every piece of collected data had been systematically reviewed once again. The compiled report showed that the entire range considered potentially relevant had been searched multiple times, both on shore and underwater, using all available equipment and techniques, yet produced no discoveries strong enough to alter the initial approach. The absence of a body, the failure to recover any dive gear, and the lack of evidence of drifting or entrapment at submerged structures left every scenario stalled at the level of hypothesis. At the same time, the process of gathering information from the community, from divers who regularly operated on the lake, and from individuals present in the area, on the day Lucas Hargrove went missing, also failed to produce any new leads, as no one had recorded any image, sound or behavior unusual enough to point toward a different investigative direction. As time passed, the likelihood of additional physical evidence emerging continued to decrease, especially in a lake environment where natural elements can quickly erase or distort traces. On that basis, the case file was transferred to long-term archive status and officially classified as a cold case, reflecting the reality that the disappearance was no longer regarded as an emergency situation resolvable through direct search measures. This classification brought a marked change in handling procedures. Active resources were gradually withdrawn and maintained only at a passive monitoring level, awaiting the possibility of new information arising from outside sources. Investigators clearly noted in the file that, at that point, there was insufficient criminal evidence to expand the investigation in a criminal direction, as all available data showed no signs of third-party intervention, no evidence of violence, coercion, or dispute, and every environmental factor aligned with the hypothesis of a diving accident in high-risk conditions. The lack of legal grounds prevented the implementation of more in-depth investigative measures, such as obtaining search warrants or tracing specific individuals, in a lawful manner. These assessments were carefully documented to ensure that, if new data emerged in the future, the file could still be reviewed without being influenced by subjective conclusions. For Lucas's family, the shift of the case to cold case status carried an especially heavy meaning, because it did not equate to a final conclusion, but only confirmed that all active search efforts had reached their limit. They were officially notified of this decision during formal but highly tense meetings, where agency representatives explained that halting the search was not an abandonment, but the inevitable consequence of having no viable leads left. However, those explanations could hardly soothe the emptiness the family had to confront, when Lucas's absence remained unconfirmed by any definitive conclusion. Their lives gradually shifted into a state of silent waiting, where each passing day carried the contradiction between fragile hope and prolonged fear, with no new information to cling to, yet also no evidence to accept a clear outcome. In the local community, the disappearance gradually faded from public attention, no longer appearing regularly in news reports or discussions, instead becoming a story occasionally retold as an example of the unpredictable dangers of the lake environment. Administratively, the cold case file was stored alongside many other cases, sharing the same characteristic of lacking leads, flagged for periodic review whenever technological advances occurred, or new data emerged from independent sources. While in theory this status allowed for reopening at any time, in practice most such files could remain dormant for many years without significant change. The disappearance of Lucas Hargrove was thus frozen on the investigative front, where time continued to pass without bringing answers, leaving his family in a prolonged silence, in which every hypothesis coexisted, but none carried evidence strong enough to confirm or refute it, and in which silence became the only element enveloping the entire case. Nearly 5 months after Lucas Hargrove's disappearance had settled into frozen status in the archived files, an unexpected event shattered that trajectory of silence, when, on an early morning, a man staggered into the emergency department of a medical facility in Kingman, in a state of severe emaciation, barely capable of self-care, with a stumbling gait, dirty and torn clothing, skin grayish from prolonged dehydration, and a body so gaunt that his ribs stood out sharply beneath taut skin. From the moment of intake, the medical team noticed that this man was not only suffering from serious physical problems, but also displayed unusual psychological signs. He startled at the slightest sounds, overreacted when anyone approached, and was unable to give complete answers to even basic questions about his name, the time, or why he was there. Nurses noted that he kept scanning the room with panicked eyes, as if searching for an escape route or bracing against an invisible threat, while frequently muttering disjointed phrases with unclear meaning. When asked to provide personal information, the man could only manage with difficulty to utter a familiar name that some experienced staff members, who had dealt with homeless cases or abandoned victims, recognized Lucas, though he could not complete the last name or supply any other details. During the initial examination, doctors discovered multiple signs indicating he had endured a long period of severe malnutrition, clear muscle atrophy, a mix of old and new scrapes across his skin, and unusual injuries around his wrists and ankles that did not match typical household accidents. The combination of extreme physical depletion, unexplained injuries, and persistent panic led the medical team to suspect this was not simply a case of a lone drifter or spontaneous mental disorder. As the admission record was being prepared, an administrative staff member cross-checked the preliminary identification against the internal database and noticed a disturbing match between the name Lucas and a physical description that reasonably aligned with a missing person report issued in the region many months earlier. This suspicion was quickly passed to the attending physician, who requested a review of old missing persons bulletins and alerts on file, leading to confirmation that Lucas Hargrove, a civilian diver who had vanished near Lake Mead, was still listed as an unresolved cold case. Faced with the possibility that the man lying in the hospital bed could be the victim of a prolonged disappearance, the medical facility immediately followed mandatory protocol and contacted local police to report the appearance of an individual matching the characteristics of an archived case. While waiting for authorities to arrive, the medical team focused on stabilizing Lucas's vital signs, administering fluids, monitoring basic indicators, and minimizing any stimuli that could worsen his panic state. Clinical notes continued to reinforce the assessment that Lucas had survived an extended period under harsh living conditions. The degree of emaciation could not have developed in just a few days or weeks, but was the result of many months of restricted nutrition, movement, and medical care. When police arrived at the facility, the identification process was conducted with extreme caution, because Lucas was still unable to provide a coherent statement or clearly confirm his own identity, and any hasty conclusions could lead to serious errors. Nevertheless, the convergence of timing, the name, estimated age, and distinctive physical features, including dive-related marks noted in the old file, quickly made the possibility of mistaken identity highly unlikely. Information about Lucas's appearance in Kingman was relayed back to the units that had previously handled the missing persons file, triggering the reactivation of the entire related archive, from the initial search reports to the sealed evaluations in the cold case file. This event not only marked the discovery of a missing person found alive after many months without a trace, but also raised a series of grave questions about what had happened during the time he was gone. Because Lucas's current condition did not fit any of the single accident hypotheses previously documented. In the confined space of the hospital room, amid the beeping of heart monitors and the cold fluorescent lighting, Lucas Hargrove's reappearance carried a heavy, unsettling atmosphere. His very existence, in a state of complete physical and mental collapse, was enough to compel authorities to reopen the entire frozen missing persons file and acknowledge that what had been considered a case with no further prospect of progress had now become an entirely different situation, demanding the highest level of attention and re-evaluation. Right after the police arrived at the medical facility in Kingman, the identity confirmation process was carried out according to the standard protocol for cases suspected to involve long-term missing persons files, with the goal of reaching an independent legal conclusion that did not rely on the subjective information providing ability of the person under treatment. The first step was collecting fingerprints, performed right at the bedside under strict medical control conditions, because the man's physical state did not yet allow movement or participation in lengthy procedures. The fingerprint samples were digitized and sent to the National Identification System for comparison with archived data, including civil records, professional licenses, and other administrative files related to Lucas Hargrove. At the same time, the investigative team requested access to dental records, a highly reliable identification method in cases where external appearance has changed significantly due to emaciation, injury, or the passage of time. Lucas's dental records, previously kept through earlier treatments, were retrieved and compared with the results of the direct examination at the medical facility, where doctors noted a clear match in jaw structure, distinctive fillings, and signs of prior dental interventions recorded in the old file. Concurrently, biometric matching was conducted by comparing relatively time-stable body features, including bone proportions, limb lengths, facial framework structure, and special identifying marks such as old scars or congenital characteristics that had been documented in Lucas's administrative records, before he went missing. These data were analyzed independently to rule out the possibility of confusion with another individual sharing the same name or similar appearance. Another crucial step in the process was image comparison, when photographs of Lucas from before the time of disappearance, including ID photos, personal pictures, and images related to his diving work, were placed side by side with photographs taken at the hospital after his reappearance. Although the difference in physical condition was enormous, with a gaunt face, grayish skin, and matted tangled hair making Lucas look almost unrecognizable from his former self, the identification experts were still able to confirm numerous undeniable points of similarity in cheekbone structure, jawline contour, and the spacing between facial features. When the results from fingerprints, dental records, biometrics, and image analysis were compiled, they formed a consistent chain of confirmation with no significant contradictions or discrepancies, sufficient for the authorities to reach the legal conclusion that the man under treatment was indeed Lucas Hargrove, the individual reported missing near Lake Mead many months earlier. This conclusion was formalized in an official document, accompanied by technical appendices and confirmation minutes from the involved units, to ensure that the identification fully met legal standards and could be used in any subsequent procedures if necessary. After the conclusion was signed and confirmed, information about Lucas being alive and officially identified was transmitted to the units that had previously handled the missing persons file, while simultaneously activating the family notification procedure. Contact with relatives was carried out with great caution, through the points of contact previously recorded in the file, with the participation of agency representatives to ensure accuracy and avoid misunderstandings. For Lucas's family, the formal notification call not only confirmed that their loved one was still alive, but also ended a long period steeped in uncertainty, where every assumption had coexisted without solid verification. However, along with the initial relief, the notification also came with limited information about Lucas's current condition, enough to affirm that he was receiving medical care, but not yet able to provide a clear explanation of what had happened during the time he was missing. Administratively, the confirmation of Lucas Hargrove's identity marked a major turning point. The missing persons file, previously archived as a cold case, was now updated with a new status, reflecting that the individual involved had been found alive, and his identity confirmed beyond any doubt. Once the identity confirmation procedures were completed, Lucas was no longer regarded as a questionable case needing clarification, but as a fully established legal and biological individual, shifting the focus of attention away from the question of who he was, and toward the question of what had happened to him during the period of disappearance. That very shift created a heavy silence in the hospital space, where every gaze turned toward Lucas's emaciated body, as living proof of something that could not yet be named in words. From that point onward, the assessment of his health condition no longer served merely as procedural support, but became the sole key to understanding the nature of the 5-month period that had been erased from his life, as the medical file was opened and continuously updated, sketching a picture of total collapse that showed this was not the aftermath of a short-term incident, but the trace of a prolonged and systematic process of harm. Doctors recorded severe malnutrition, evidenced by a body mass index significantly below the safe threshold, near depleted fat reserves, and widespread muscle atrophy, particularly pronounced in load-bearing muscle groups, such as the thighs, shoulders, and back. Biochemical tests revealed deeply reduced serum protein levels, deficiencies in multiple essential vitamins, and prolonged electrolyte imbalances, signs that typically appear only when the body has endured continuous malnutrition for many consecutive months. In addition, liver and kidney function indicators reflected a long period of adaptation to an unstable diet and restricted water intake, indicating that the depletion had occurred gradually and persistently. Alongside this, the clinical examination uncovered distinctive injuries on the wrists and ankles, where faint indentations had turned into scar tissue, accompanied by signs of chronic inflammation around the joints. These injuries displayed symmetrical shapes and nearly identical positions on both sides of the body, a feature inconsistent with random accidents or ordinary household trauma, and strongly suggesting that these limbs had once been restrained for an extended period, using ropes, cuffs, or other devices limiting movement. The repeated pattern of soft tissue damage around the joints indicated that pressure had been maintained for many days, even weeks, rather than being a momentary force. Beyond the nutritional and mechanical injury signs, dermatologists and endocrinologists also noted clear manifestations of prolonged lack of exposure to natural light, including changes in skin pigmentation, abnormally low vitamin D levels, and heightened sensitivity when exposed to bright light. These symptoms are commonly seen in individuals living in enclosed or semi-enclosed environments where sunlight is severely restricted, and are inconsistent with the scenario of a diver who frequently worked outdoors. Lucas's skin also showed numerous old scrapes at various stages of healing, along with mild inflammatory patches due to inadequate hygiene and medical care, indicating he had lived under conditions lacking basic personal sanitation. When these examination results were compared against the mechanism of a diving accident, the incompatibility became evident, because serious underwater incidents typically leave characteristic signs such as decompression injuries, pulmonary edema, alveolar hemorrhage, barotrauma to the ears and sinuses, or acute impact injuries from collisions with underwater terrain. Lucas's file recorded none of these signs, and in-depth imaging studies showed no acute injuries consistent with a diving mishap. Instead, the identified injuries were all chronic, accumulated over time, reflecting a prolonged process of enduring restricted freedom of movement and access to basic needs. The expert opinion from a forensic physician, invited for an independent evaluation, reinforced these clinical findings as they analyzed the entire medical dataset, from blood tests and imaging to detailed descriptions of wounds and biological markers. According to the forensic conclusion, the combination of prolonged malnutrition, signs of limb restraint, lack of natural light, and non-acute injuries formed a classic pattern of long-term captivity and control, where the victim was deprived of the ability to move freely and denied adequate medical care. The experts also emphasized that the degree of Lucas's emaciation indicated he had survived under extremely restricted conditions, with just enough nutrition to sustain life, but not enough to preserve health, a state commonly documented in cases of prolonged unlawful detention. When the complete medical file was compiled into an official report, these conclusions entirely ruled out the diving accident hypothesis that had previously been considered the most reasonable explanation for Lucas's disappearance. No biological evidence supported the scenario of a single underwater incident, and every sign on his body pointed to a prolonged systematic process of harm that could not have originated from ordinary occupational risks. As the medical conclusions were gradually finalized, Lucas's treatment file extended beyond the pure framework of healthcare to become an objective record of what the human body can endure under deliberate control, where every sign of depletion and injury completely refuted the hypothesis of a random accident or harsh natural conditions. From that point onward, the focus of the evaluation no longer stopped at the question of what had been done to his body, but was forced to expand to the question of how his mind had been affected throughout the entire prolonged period of disappearance. This shift in direction led to a psychological assessment process being carried out in parallel with physical treatment, which quickly revealed that Lucas not only bore clear biological damage, but also exhibited the full range of symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, a diagnosis established on the basis of prolonged clinical observation and tightly controlled interview sessions. Psychologists noted that Lucas frequently entered a state of heightened alertness, reacting strongly to minor stimuli, such as the sound of a door closing, unexpected footsteps, or sudden changes in lighting, accompanied by physical tension and rapid breathing, indicating that his nervous system was in a state of prolonged defense. Lucas's memory capacity was significantly disrupted, particularly with regard to events directly related to the period of disappearance. He could recall clear details from before the time he went missing, but faced severe difficulty in reconstructing the timeline or specific events afterward. Cognitive tests showed that his short-term and long-term memory were not structurally impaired, but the disruption stemmed from a psychological avoidance mechanism, where the brain actively blocked access to memories that were painful or threatening to his current mental stability. During supervised sessions with experts, Lucas displayed a pronounced tendency to avoid providing detailed information about the missing period, often redirecting answers to vague generalities, falling into prolonged silence, or showing signs of stress such as trembling hands, sweating, and loss of focus. These reactions were not indicative of intentional concealment of information, but were consistent with the pattern seen in trauma victims, where directly confronting traumatic memories can trigger physiological and psychological responses beyond their control. In particular, the experts recorded Lucas's clear fear response to certain specific keywords and concepts, such as confined spaces, being tied up, darkness, or phrases evoking the loss of freedom, where merely hearing or reading those words was enough to send him into a state of intense stress, with unfocused eyes and a rapidly elevated heart rate. These reactions were considered classic signs of PTSD, in which even indirect triggers reminiscent of the past can reactivate the sense of danger once experienced. Given this situation, the psychologist strongly advised that attempting to obtain a direct statement from Lucas at this time would not only be ineffective, but also carried the risk of further damaging his mental health, as the pressure to recall and recount events could exacerbate his trauma symptoms. Expert assessments emphasized that statements obtained in such a psychological state would have low reliability, not because the victim was dishonest, but because the memory processing process was disrupted and heavily influenced by the brain's self-protective mechanisms. Therefore, the specialists unanimously agreed that the investigation could not and should not rely on Lucas's direct testimony as the primary source of information. Instead, a key decision was made to prioritize the use of indirect evidence, including physical data, medical records, biological traces, and objective information that could be gathered independently of the victim's psychological state. This approach was deemed necessary both to protect Lucas from the risk of re-traumatization and to ensure that the process of clarifying what happened did not depend on his unstable memory capacity. For the professional team, the psychological evaluation served not only to provide a clinical diagnosis, but also to guide the overall approach to the case, as Lucas's mental state had become a pivotal factor determining the limits and possibilities of all information-gathering efforts. In that context, his psychological file clearly reflected that what had occurred during the period of disappearance had left profound and lasting consequences, ones that could not be approached through conventional investigative methods, relying on direct accounts, but instead required a cautious, indirect strategy grounded in objective evidence, where the victim's safety and stability were placed on equal footing with the need to uncover the truth. On the basis of the medical conclusions and psychological assessments that had been established independently, consistently, and with high professional value, the authorities reached the official decision to reopen the file that had been placed in long-term storage, ending the passive status of a frozen case and reactivating the entire investigative process according to criminal standards. This decision was recorded in a specific administrative document, accompanied by an update to the file's status in the management system, while also notifying all units that had previously participated in handling the disappearance to ensure continuity and data uniformity. Along with reopening the file, the case classification was clearly adjusted from a disappearance suspected due to accident to suspected kidnapping and unlawful detention, accurately reflecting the nature of the confirmed biological, psychological, and objective circumstantial evidence. This change in classification carried crucial legal significance, as it opened the possibility of applying criminal investigative measures that previously lacked sufficient grounds for implementation, while at the same time placing the case in a high-priority group due to its involvement with serious prolonged violations of personal freedom. On that foundation, a dedicated investigative task force was established with an interagency structure, including experienced criminal investigators, specialized in kidnapping and unlawful detention cases, forensic experts, digital data analysts, legal unit representatives, and prosecutors responsible for advising on procedural matters to ensure that every step complied with legal requirements and could withstand rigorous future scrutiny. The formation of the task force was not merely formal, but came with specific task assignments, in which each small group was responsible for an independent area to avoid overlap and omissions. One group was assigned to review the entire old file, including search reports, scene documentation, sonar data, area maps, and previously issued administrative decisions, with the goal of identifying assumptions that had been accepted in the context of limited information and re-evaluating them, in light of the new conclusions. Another group focused on reconstructing a detailed timeline, based on objective data such as activity logs, administrative records, telecommunications data, and any documents that could establish verifiable time markers, in order to create an accurate reference framework for all subsequent investigative activities. In parallel, a group dedicated to physical evidence was tasked with planning the collection, preservation, and analysis of traces at risk of deterioration over time, from environmental data and short-term archived camera footage to administrative documents with limited retention cycles. This task division was designed to ensure that no area was left uncovered, and that every piece of collected information had a clearly accountable point of contact. At the same time, the scope of the investigation was redefined with significant expansion. The focus was no longer limited to the initial access area, but now encompassed on-shore spaces, lesser-noticed secondary roads, remote locations, and sites with characteristics suitable for long-term human confinement, without easy detection. This expanded scope also included examining individuals and activities indirectly related to the victim's professional environment, not only based on personal relationships, but also on access to terrain, vehicles, and specialized knowledge necessary to control someone with experience in survival and outdoor activities. During the process of defining the scope, the task force agreed that every new assumption must be built on verifiable data and logic, avoiding repetition of the speculative approach that had existed when the case was still considered an accident. The evidence collection plan was constructed with a clear order of priority, first focusing on data most vulnerable to loss over time, while strictly adhering to preservation protocols to maintain legal value. This approach aligned with the psychologist's recommendation that the investigation could not rely on the victim's direct testimony as the primary source of information in the current context, forcing the probe to depend mainly on indirect, objective, and independently verifiable evidence. Reopening the file also led to official exchanges with relevant units at multiple levels, to ensure that all information, from initial reports to data never previously deeply exploited, was consolidated into a unified data repository for analysis. During the reopening process, investigators placed particular emphasis on eliminating outdated conclusions that no longer fit, preventing assumptions formed in a context of limited information from continuing to influence the new investigative direction. The task force unanimously agreed that the core objective was to reconstruct the chain of events using verifiable milestones, rather than seeking a quick explanation lacking solid foundation. The reactivation of the file thus marked a decisive shift from merely reviewing old information to a proactive investigative model, in which the entire strategy was restructured to pursue the truth based on independent, highly verifiable evidence, rather than depending on assumptions or untestable accounts. From that foundation, the next investigative direction was established logically, as the investigators focused on the key task of identifying the point of origin of the criminal act, beginning with a systematic analysis of all remaining movement data of Lucas prior to the time of disappearance, in order to accurately reconstruct the final moments when he still had control over his own journey and personal safety. Digital forensics experts collected and synchronized every available data source, including mobile phone location history, mobile network connection logs, GPS data from installed applications, information from his personal vehicle, and independently verifiable administrative time markers, such as transactions, card signals, or device logs. When layering these data sets together, they observed that Lucas's movement pattern showed high consistency up until a specific point, when all sources of location-related signals abruptly and simultaneously ceased. This cessation did not exhibit the characteristics of gradually weakening signals or drifting as commonly seen in underwater accident scenarios, but rather presented a sharp cutoff, suggesting that the devices had been disabled or separated from their subject at a definite location. This anomalous signal loss timestamp was pinpointed with high accuracy, coinciding with the period when Lucas was believed to have completed his dive and was preparing to leave the access area, creating a crucial analytical anchor for cross-referencing with other data sources. On the basis of that timestamp, the task force conducted a comprehensive review of the entire camera system around the Lake Mead shoreline, including traffic cameras on main and secondary roads, cameras at parking lots, service facilities, rest stops, as well as private surveillance devices capable of capturing images of vehicles or individuals within the relevant time frame. The review was not limited to searching for direct images of Lucas, but also aimed to identify abnormal patterns of absence, such as his failure to appear at points that anyone leaving the area in a normal manner would inevitably pass through. Image data showed no evidence that Lucas departed by personal vehicle or on foot along common routes after the signal loss timestamp, reinforcing the assessment that he had not left the area freely in a natural way. The precise determination of the anomalous signal loss time allowed analysts to eliminate many prior hypotheses, because in diving accident cases, devices typically continue to emit weak signals or are recorded at various drifting locations over a certain period, rather than terminating all at once and decisively. From this conclusion, the investigation scope was narrowed along onshore areas near the access point, where conditions converged to enable the subduing of an individual without attracting attention, including terrain that obstructed visibility, short distances to low-traffic secondary roads, and quick vehicle access. Investigators meticulously analyzed each location within this range, evaluating factors such as sightlines from surrounding points, audibility of sounds, and the level of human presence during the specified time frame. In parallel, the possibility that Lucas had been subdued underwater was seriously considered and subsequently ruled out based on technical reasoning and environmental data, because controlling an experienced diver in a deep underwater environment would require complex coordination, specialized equipment, and a high level of risk for the perpetrator, while almost certainly leaving biological traces, drifting gear, or distinctive injuries, none of which were documented in the search or medical records. The absence of any signs of decompression sickness, barotrauma, or acute water-related injuries in the medical conclusions further strengthened the assessment that the intervention had taken place on shore, in a space where Lucas was no longer protected by the open environment and his freedom of movement. From those analyses, the task force proceeded to fix the point of origin of the crime by overlaying the signal loss timestamp, camera coverage areas, terrain characteristics, and feasible movement routes to identify a narrow zone where the likelihood of control being established was highest. This fixation was not based on personal speculation, but was the result of a systematic elimination process in which every element was evaluated based on data and verifiable logic. The identified area converged all the necessary conditions for a quick, discrete, and effective act of control, while aligning with the timeline and indirect evidence collected. Identifying the point of origin not only clarified the location where Lucas lost his freedom, but also provided a solid analytical foundation for understanding that his disappearance was not the result of natural environmental factors or occupational risks, but the consequence of a deliberate action that occurred at a specific location and within a determinable time frame. In that context, the entire process of determining the point of restraint became a crucial turning point, as for the first time the timeline of the case was anchored to a concrete space and moment, enabling the reconstruction of the chain of events using objective evidence and tight logic, rather than continuing to rely on the vague assumptions that had existed when the case was still regarded as an unsolved accident. This very fixation forced the focus of the analysis to shift from where and when it happened to the more core question of why Lucas Hargrove became a target, leading to a thorough review of all his independent diving activities at Lake Mead to determine what he might have seen, noted, or inadvertently come into possession of, thereby explaining the motive for not only subduing him, but also keeping him alive for an extended period. through examination of the personal devices recovered after his reappearance, including removable memory cards, handwritten dive logs, technical sketches, and positioning data tied to each dive, the investigators discovered that Lucas had recorded numerous anomalous points on the lake bottom that did not match any permitted survey areas or popular recreational dive routes. These notes were not speculative in nature, but were presented in a technical style, reflecting Lucas's familiarity with the lake bed structure and showing that he had observed the presence of metal devices, fixed anchors, and traces of mechanical intervention that could not have formed naturally. Cross-referencing those observations with administrative data and environmental reports revealed that no legal projects had been approved at the corresponding locations, thereby raising the possibility of clandestine illegal extraction activities taking place beneath the water surface, taking advantage of the depth, turbidity, and limited oversight in the area. Experts invited to evaluate concluded that this activity was highly likely related to unauthorized salvage of metal, submerged equipment, or assets of historical and economic value, which, if discovered, would carry severe legal consequences for those behind it. In that context, Lucas was not an anonymous outsider, but became an individual holding key information capable of triggering a large-scale investigation if he chose to report or share the data with authorities. Assessing the value of the information Lucas possessed showed that even a small portion of his observations, if confirmed, would be sufficient to prove the existence of an organized criminal network, with potential damage far exceeding a single administrative violation. This very factor clarified the motive for silencing a witness as a defensive reaction by those involved, because allowing Lucas to walk free with that knowledge would equate to a complete loss of control over the situation. However, the motive analysis did not stop at explaining why he was targeted, but also had to address why the victim was not killed immediately from the start. Criminal behavioral analysts pointed out that in many cases involving witnesses holding sensitive information, keeping the victim alive allows the perpetrators to maintain control, both preventing information disclosure and creating space to extract further data, assess risk levels, and determine how far the information may have spread. Keeping Lucas alive also helped avoid creating an unexplained death, which would almost certainly draw intense media and federal investigative attention, especially given the context involving a sensitive area in terms of security and environment. From a tactical perspective, kidnapping became a lower-risk choice compared to murder, as it allowed for delay, manipulation, and control over the pace of events, rather than triggering an immediate external response. When linking the motive to the kidnapping behavior, investigators noted a clear consistency between the timing of Lucas's disappearance and the dives he had conducted immediately prior, indicating that the act of control was not random, but directly tied to what he had just observed. The fact that he was deprived of freedom right after completing a decisive diving activity further reinforced the hypothesis that the perpetrators had monitored, identified, and acted when they assessed that the risk level posed by Lucas's existence had exceeded the acceptable threshold. The entire analysis process showed that the criminal motive formed from the intersection of illicit economic interests, fear of exposure, and the need to control information, turning a civilian diver into the target of a deliberate kidnapping. Once the motive elements had been arranged within a unified logical framework, the central question of the investigation no longer stopped at why Lucas was subdued and kept alive, but shifted to the more practical issue of who possessed sufficient capability, conditions, and interests to carry out such a discreet, selective, and prolonged act. This very shift paved the way for the next investigative step, in which the identification of suspects was implemented as a process of tracking down specific individuals based on a systematic elimination method, cross-referencing multiple data sources, and verifying capability, opportunity, and real-world connections to the Lake Mead area and the established illegal activities. The investigators began by reviewing all individuals with practical knowledge of advanced diving operations, the shoreline terrain of Lake Mead, and the operational conditions required to access the area without drawing attention. The initial list included civilian divers, personnel who had previously participated in survey projects, individuals with technical diving certifications, as well as long-term residents around the lake who had detailed knowledge of unofficial access routes. From this broad list, the task force applied screening criteria based on access to vehicles, familiarity with low surveillance areas, and movement schedules that overlapped with the time of Lucas's disappearance. In parallel with the personnel review, vehicle analysis experts compiled data on vehicles that had appeared around the lakeshore during the critical time frame, including light trucks, trailers, small boats, and vehicles capable of transporting heavy equipment. This data was gathered from traffic cameras, parking lot records, resident reports, and indirect sources such as fuel transactions or vehicle repairs in the proximate time period. When cross-referencing timelines, certain vehicles appeared repeatedly at different locations around the lake without any clear legitimate reason, creating anomalies that required deeper analysis. Cross-checking vehicle data with the exact moment of Lucas's signal loss allowed the elimination of most unrelated cases, as only individuals present within that very narrow time window could have carried out the act of control. From dozens of initial names, the suspect list was gradually narrowed through the elimination of those with solid alibis, incompatible work schedules, or lack of the technical capability needed to subdue an adult diver. This process was not a one-time event, but was repeated through multiple rounds, with each round incorporating new data and refining evaluation criteria to avoid oversights or premature conclusions. Ultimately, one name emerged with an unusually high degree of match across multiple dimensions: Calvin Rourke, 52 years old, with no fixed residence, but a long-term history of living around the lake area. The identification of Rourke was not based on a single piece of evidence, but on the convergence of numerous factors. He had technical diving experience from his younger years, had participated in activities related to underwater salvage and repair, owned suitable vehicles, and appeared in camera data at the lakeshore area during the exact time frame of Lucas's disappearance. When Rourke's file was expanded, investigators discovered he had a fragmented professional history, with multiple periods of unclear income sources that coincided with times when signs of unauthorized underwater extraction appeared. Background checks revealed that Rourke had previously been investigated in cases involving resource violations and trespassing in restricted areas, though he had never received a serious conviction, establishing a behavioral precedent of willingness to cross legal boundaries. His financial records also showed irregular inflows inconsistent with declared employment, reinforcing suspicions of involvement in covert operations. Investigators continued to dig into Rourke's criminal history and prior interactions with the local diving community, discovering that he had had conflicts with individuals considered outsiders, particularly independent divers, not part of familiar networks. When cross-referencing social connections, Rourke was found to have indirect ties to several individuals previously suspected of involvement in underwater profiteering activities, forming a loose but sufficient network to support operations requiring discrete coordination. Information gathered on his living habits showed that Rourke frequently appeared in low-traffic areas around the lake at irregular hours, consistent with an operational pattern designed to avoid attention. When these data points were layered together, they formed a consistent picture in which Rourke not only had a potential motive tied to concealing illegal activities, but also possessed the actual capability and opportunity to subdue Lucas at the previously identified point of origin. Narrowing the suspect list down to a single name was not considered a final conclusion, but rather a step to establish a primary target for more in-depth investigative actions. However, the degree to which Rourke fit the entire chain of events made him the prime suspect with the highest probability among all considered scenarios. The entire identification process reflected the task force's cautious yet decisive approach, in which every element of personal background, vehicles, timing, and prior record was evaluated in tight relation to one another, ensuring that naming a suspect was not based on intuition, but on a logical structure built from data, elimination, and the convergence of evidence. From that foundation, the next investigative direction opened up inevitably when the search for the location where Lucas Hargrove was held was implemented as a focused exploratory operation. stemming directly from the established suspect and the analysis of Calvin Rourke's extended movement patterns over many months, in which a series of repeatedly anomalous stopping points appeared at remote areas completely isolated from residential life and any form of legitimate activity. Based on the approved search warrant, multiple coordinated task forces simultaneously conducted inspections of suspected locations on the outskirts of populated areas, prioritizing sites capable of long-term concealment while still allowing vehicle access without attracting attention. The focal point was quickly established at a parcel of land deep in the Mojave Desert, where an abandoned structure originally built decades earlier as a technical warehouse stood, later left derelict, and no longer appearing in current management records. This structure was far from main roads, surrounded by rugged rocky terrain and wide stretches of open land, making observation from a distance nearly impossible, while still featuring a single access route sufficient for light trucks to enter and exit, consistent with a pattern of prolonged discrete operations. When authorities approached and entered the structure, the first signs indicated that this was not a completely forgotten building, but one that had been actively used by humans in recent times for a clear purpose. Inside the enclosed space, investigators discovered numerous indicators of long-term habitation, including a separately arranged sleeping area, surfaces covered with rudimentary insulating materials, stored water in large containers, showing signs of periodic replacement, and a stockpile of dry food organized in a way that suggested ongoing maintenance rather than short-term use. Portable lighting equipment, backup batteries, and fuel traces showed that temporary power had been used in a calculated manner, sufficient to maintain minimal lighting without detection from outside. These combined elements reflected a controlled living pattern capable of sustaining at least one individual's life for many months without external contact. Environmental forensic experts measured dust accumulation levels, footprints, floor and wall wear patterns, determining that the structure had been in continuous use during the period corresponding to the 5 months Lucas was missing, with entry and exit frequency consistent with periodic provisioning of essentials. The physical conditions of the space also demonstrated that it fully met the necessary criteria for unlawful human confinement: thick construction, few windows, ability to control light and sound, and complete isolation from areas with human traffic. On fixed surfaces, authorities recorded scratches, abrasions, and signs of temporary attachment of metal objects, consistent with long-term movement restriction, and matching the wrist and ankle injuries documented in Lucas's medical file. Certain areas within the structure showed clear functional divisions, with living spaces separated from more tightly controlled zones, reflecting an arrangement designed to maintain control over the detained person while ensuring minimal conditions for prolonged use. Cross-referencing the spatial layout, habitation traces, and usage timeline allowed investigators to determine that this structure was not used randomly, but had been selected and prepared in advance specifically to serve the purpose of long-term detention, aligning with the entire body of data collected from prior investigative stages. Once the physical indicators reached the threshold for initial confirmation, the scene was immediately secured according to protocol, with the establishment of a security perimeter, strict control of access points, and documentation of all entry activities to preserve evidence integrity. Forensic teams systematically collected samples, including household items, biological traces, soil samples, dust samples, and other environmental components, all sealed and labeled for in-depth analysis. Securing the scene was not only intended to prevent unauthorized intrusion, but also reflected the task force's assessment that this abandoned structure was likely the place where Lucas had been held for the entire duration of his disappearance. The existence of a specific location, with signs of long-term habitation, conditions suitable for human control, and a timeline perfectly matching the 5 months Lucas was gone, shifted the case from a chain of hypotheses, based on indirect analysis, to a tangible crime scene, with high evidentiary value. Identifying the detention site closed the largest gap in the case timeline, not only answering where Lucas had been held, but also clearly affirming that this was a deliberate act, maintained over an extended period and systematically concealed, reflecting the perpetrator's level of preparation and absolute control. From this point, the investigative process moved into the phase of crime scene examination with strict forensic standards, as the abandoned structure in the middle of the Mojave Desert was secured and treated as a complete crime scene, with the aim of reconstructing the method of confinement and establishing a direct link between this space and the injuries and biological signs recorded on Lucas Hargrove's body. The on-scene forensic teams conducted their sweep along a closed spatial axis, starting from the fixed points likely used to restrict movement, where they recovered multiple lengths of high-strength synthetic rope with frayed surfaces and repeated tension marks, along with small metal locks attached to fixed hooks, drilled directly into the concrete and steel framework. These locks showed signs of prolonged use with slight deformation at load-bearing points, indicating they had been repeatedly opened and closed under tension, consistent with securing wrists and ankles in a restrictive position. On the surrounding wall and floor surfaces near the restraint points, investigators recorded a system of parallel scratches at consistent heights from the floor and spacing that matched the repetitive movements of a bound individual, reflecting efforts to shift position in a confined space to relieve pain or maintain circulation. These wear marks were not randomly distributed, but concentrated in a single zone, indicating this was the primary control point and was used frequently, not as a one-time occurrence. Overall analysis of habitation traces showed a deliberate minimum level, evident in the presence of only essential items for basic survival, such as water barrels, simple dry food and low-power portable lighting, while completely lacking personal items, comforts or entertainment, thereby reflecting an environment organized to sustain existence under controlled conditions rather than free habitation. The quantity of food discovered showed clear portion division with signs of regular cyclical use, consistent with maintaining the body at a minimal state and matching the prolonged malnutrition condition documented in Lucas's medical file. Forensic experts conducted direct comparisons between the seized evidence and the victim's injuries, particularly the circular marks on the wrists and ankles, noting a high degree of compatibility in size, shape and contact points, allowing confirmation that the very ropes and locks recovered at the scene had been used to restrain Lucas over an extended period. The absence of natural light in the structure, combined with the arrangement of artificial lighting at low and uneven positions, logically explained the signs of light adaptation impairment and circadian rhythm disruption recorded when Lucas was admitted to the medical facility. Microscopic analysis of biological samples collected from the floor, fixed surfaces, and items revealed the presence of skin cells, sweat, and biological traces, consistent with a single individual, while showing no significant signs of habitation by multiple others, indicating the structure was primarily used to detain one victim over a prolonged period. These biological traces were distributed in a pattern consistent with the fixed positions, reinforcing the assessment of continuous and systematic movement control. The on-scene forensic conclusion was built on a synthesis of spatial layout, restraint tools, wear marks, and biological data, confirming that this location fully met the criteria of a deliberately established detention site maintained stably for many months. Comprehensive cross-referencing between the scene and the medical file allowed exclusion of the possibility that this was merely a temporary shelter or random habitation site, as the level of control and the compatibility between injuries and physical evidence far exceeded what could arise in non-coercive situations. The process of strengthening incriminating evidence was carried out by linking each physical element to specific behaviors, from restraint tools, fixed points, movement traces to the physiological consequences on the victim, forming a closed chain of evidence with high probative value. The examination results transformed the abandoned structure from a suspected location into an authenticated crime scene, where the physical traces consistently recounted the story of prolonged deprivation of freedom, aligning with the entire body of prior investigative data. From the forensic conclusions at the scene, the picture of the period during which Lucas Hargrove was held no longer carried an element of conjecture, but was established through specific physical traces, showing that he had been controlled in a space that was deliberately prepared and operated, sufficiently to cause the documented state of emaciation and injury on his body. On the foundation of this solid physical evidence, the focus of the investigation continued to shift toward analyzing the modus operandi of the crime, where the entire sequence of control actions was examined as a logical, calculated chain of operations tightly linked to the established motive, reflecting the perpetrator's thorough level of preparation, as well as a deep understanding of both human physiology and the environment. The approach to the victim did not occur randomly, but was deliberately chosen at the moment. Lucas had just completed his personal dive, when his physical condition was beginning to decline due to energy expenditure. His attention was focused on removing equipment, and his familiar sense of security in the area created a brief but sufficient window for action. The access area selected was a low-traffic section of the lakeshore with natural visual obstruction, limited sightlines from main roads, and no regular presence of management personnel, allowing the perpetrator to approach head-on without being observed. The control method was executed swiftly and decisively, aimed at neutralizing resistance before the victim could fully register the threat, as evidenced by the lack of signs of major struggle or acute injuries at the point of origin. This indicates the perpetrator prioritized the element of surprise, intimidation capability, and positional control over crude violence, both to reduce the risk of unintentionally causing fatal injuries and to minimize environmental traces as much as possible. After gaining control of the victim, the transport process was carried out along a pre-calculated route, avoiding monitored roads, limiting stops, and eliminating the possibility of the victim leaving biological traces or positioning signals. The absence of any personal items, signs of struggle, or leads along common routes shows that the perpetrator had proactively disabled communication devices and tightly controlled every factor that could lead to tracing. The prolonged detention method clearly demonstrated calculated intent to sustain the victim's life while maintaining a controlled state of emaciation, reflecting an understanding of human physiological limits. The victim was provided with food and water at a minimal level, enough to prevent death but insufficient for physical recovery, combined with restricted space, poor lighting, and harsh living conditions to maintain prolonged dependence and weakness. The fact that no lethal action was taken throughout the detention period shows that the objective of the act was not to eliminate the victim, but to maintain control, extending the time needed to protect the perpetrator's core interests. In parallel with physical control, psychological control tactics were implemented consistently and effectively, through complete isolation from the social environment, severing all information about time, location, and the possibility of rescue, causing the victim to fall into a state of disorientation and dependency. The lack of specific time references, no confirmation of the future, and the maintenance of an underlying threatening presence created prolonged fear, sufficient to erode resistance without requiring frequent violence. The avoidance behaviors, memory disruptions, and panic responses recorded after Lucas's reappearance fit this model of psychological control, where the victim was forced to focus on immediate survival rather than retaining detailed event memories. The threat level was maintained at just enough intensity, not aimed at causing severe injury, but to deeply instill a sense of insecurity and helplessness, thereby reinforcing compliance. When the entire chain of behaviors is cross-referenced with the established motive, a clear compatibility emerges between the goal of concealing illegal activities and the choice of kidnapping and detention over murder. Keeping the victim alive helped the perpetrator avoid triggering the intense investigative response typically associated with an unexplained death, while also allowing assessment of the extent of information the victim possessed and whether that information had already been shared. The modus operandi in this case was not impulsive or emotional, but reflected a calculated decision-making process in which each step was designed to minimize risk, extend duration, and maintain absolute control over the outcome. The tight compatibility between the approach to the victim, the method of control, the movement pattern, the detention conditions, and the physical-psychological consequences recorded on Lucas demonstrates that the criminal act was not random, but carried out by an individual with practical experience, knowledge of the terrain, and the ability to control human behavior over an extended period while still avoiding detection. On the foundation of that assessment, the investigative process moved to the next step with the reception of supplemental testimony from Lucas Hargrove according to a cautious and controlled sequence, designed to suit the victim's psychological state and level of cognitive recovery after the prolonged period of detention. Lucas did not provide a complete narrative all at once. Instead, pieces of information were given in fragments, tied to specific details as his memory gradually stabilized, allowing investigators to reconstruct the picture of events without applying pressure beyond his capacity to endure. The initial information Lucas confirmed focused on the fact that he had directly observed illegal activities beneath the lake during multiple dives prior to his disappearance, including the presence of unmarked structures and equipment showing signs of systematic installation and use. Lucas described that these structures did not appear in any maps or technical documents he had ever accessed, while bearing characteristics that could not be explained by legitimate activities such as research or maintenance, reinforcing the conclusion that he had inadvertently become a witness to a carefully concealed unlawful operation. When supported by in-depth interview methods appropriate for trauma victims, Lucas gradually clarified that he had recognized the abnormality of what he saw and had considered the possibility of reporting it, though he had not yet had the chance to do so before the control incident occurred. His descriptions of the timing and circumstances of being approached on shore aligned closely with the signal loss timestamp, the fixed geographic location, and prior technical data, allowing direct cross-referencing of the testimony with the investigative file without any contradictions arising. Lucas confirmed that the act of control happened quickly, without prolonged struggle, and from the very first minutes he clearly perceived that the perpetrator's objective was not immediate injury but control and isolation. Subsequent descriptions of the detention conditions were provided by Lucas in parts, including the restricted space, minimal lighting, prolonged movement restriction, and tightly controlled rhythm of essential supply deliveries, all of which matched the physical traces and forensic conclusions at the detention site. In particular, Lucas clearly described the sensation of disorientation regarding time and space, the prolonged state of psychological dependence, and the constant fear in the face of indirect threats, consistent with the psychological evaluation and the established analysis of the crime's modus operandi. As the testimony progressed deeper, Lucas began to clarify the suspect's role throughout the entire process, confirming direct presence, control over detention conditions, and behaviors aimed at maintaining the victim's compliance, thereby demonstrating a clear level of premeditation and criminal intent. Details about the methods of movement, timing of resupply, and efforts to avoid leaving external traces were described by Lucas in ways that aligned with the wear patterns, item distribution, and environmental data collected, creating consistent correspondence between the testimony and objective evidence. Every piece of information Lucas provided was cross-verified against independent sources before being integrated into the file, ensuring that the testimony not only reflected personal experience, but also met the standard for usable evidence in prosecution. As the fragments of memory were pieced together, the suspect's role in organizing, maintaining, and concealing the detention became clear, while also illuminating the direct connection between the motive of concealing illegal activities and the tactical decisions made throughout the period of control. On that basis, the prosecution file was gradually completed, with prosecutors and investigators collaborating to organize Lucas's testimony into logical event milestones, tightly linked to physical evidence, technical data, and forensic conclusions, in order to form a closed chain of proof. Details that could not be verified or carried subjective conjecture were set aside separately, while content showing high compatibility with objective evidence was standardized for court use. When the level of completeness, consistency, and reliability of the file reached the necessary threshold, procedures to prepare an arrest warrant were initiated on the grounds that Lucas's supplemental testimony not only strengthened, but also finalized the incriminating structure, transforming previous analyses and inferences into a solid legal foundation. When Lucas's supplemental statements were fully cross-referenced with physical evidence and forensic conclusions, the picture of the criminal act no longer contained any major gaps, allowing the task force to establish a tightly structured prosecution file in which living testimony and material evidence, supported each other in a consistent and objective manner. From that point onward, the investigative process shifted to the action phase, when the arrest of the suspect was carried out on the basis of the fully completed legal conditions, with a detailed plan designed to ensure the safety of the executing forces, minimize risks to the community, and preserve the absolute integrity of the entire evidence system that had been collected. Authorities precisely determined the location, daily habits, and movement patterns of Calvin Rourke through lawful surveillance measures, combined with prolonged on-site observation to select the most appropriate moment for approach. The arrest timing was chosen when the suspect was alone, without the presence of any elements that could assist in resistance or facilitate escape, while at the same time causing no impact on surrounding civilians. The arrest operation proceeded swiftly, under control, and in full compliance with procedure, involving a surprise approach, brief restraint, and clear notification of the legal basis, along with the rights afforded to the suspect under regulation. Once the suspect was safely secured, assigned task forces simultaneously executed searches of the suspect's temporary residence and the vehicles he regularly used, within the exact scope of the approved search warrant, in order to collect physical evidence directly related to the investigated offense. The search process was conducted to strict forensic standards, with detailed recording of the current state of each space, photography, diagramming, and on-site marking of evidence to ensure an unbroken chain of custody. At the suspect's residence, authorities seized numerous items of evidentiary value, including portable lighting equipment, backup batteries, water containers, dry food supplies, and rudimentary living tools, items whose characteristics, types, and degree of wear closely matched the samples discovered at the detention site. Some items showed signs of prolonged use under harsh environmental conditions, consistent with maintaining habitation in a remote location over many months, creating a tangible link between the suspect and the detention location. The search of the suspect's vehicles continued to yield critical evidence, including synthetic ropes, metal locks, fastening materials, and traces of soil and rock embedded in the storage compartments, with physical properties matching the environmental samples collected at the abandoned structure. These items were seized, sealed, numbered, and documented in detailed minutes, accompanied by descriptions of the conditions of discovery to support later cross-referencing and in-depth analysis. In parallel with tangible evidence, digital devices under the suspect's control were preserved according to digital forensic protocol, ensuring no interference that could alter data before extraction and analysis. After completing the search operations, investigators conducted a comprehensive comparison of all seized evidence against the previously built investigative file, focusing on compatibility in type, size, material, usage, wear patterns, and context of discovery. The comparison results showed a clear and striking match between the evidence obtained from the suspect's residence and vehicles, and the traces at the detention site, as well as the injuries on the victim's body, allowing the establishment of a direct physical connection between the suspect, the vehicles, and the criminal act. The comparison was not limited to superficial levels, but was performed based on specific technical criteria, ensuring that every conclusion had clear scientific and legal grounds that could be independently verified. On the basis of these results, the case file was thoroughly reviewed once again to ensure consistency among the victim's testimony, forensic conclusions, technical data, and seized physical evidence. Investigators worked closely with the legal department to finalize the indictment, in which the sequence of actions, methods of execution, the suspect's specific role, and the causal relationship between each act and the resulting consequences were described in detail. The completion of the indictment was carried out with the requirement that every element constituting the offense must be proven by specific evidence, tightly linked in a unified logical chain, and free from conjecture. Once the necessary contents had been standardized and internally verified, the entire investigative file, including arrest minutes, search results, evidence inventory, comparison reports, and related documents, was fully prepared for transfer to the prosecution authority in accordance with jurisdiction. The handover process was accompanied by operational summaries and detailed explanations, ensuring that all key information was clearly conveyed, enabling the prosecution to receive the file in a complete state, ready for review and processing according to criminal procedure. The trial was conducted after the indictment file was completed and transferred to the Nevada State Court, where Calvin Rourke faced formal criminal charges, including intentional kidnapping, prolonged unlawful detention, intentional infliction of serious physical and mental harm, along with aggravating circumstances related to controlling the victim over an extended period in order to serve the motive of silencing a witness. At the trial, the prosecution presented a structured system of evidence in logical sequence, beginning with the physical evidence seized at the detention site in the Mojave Desert, including restraint ropes, metal locks, fixed points on the walls and floor, traces of minimal habitation, and biological samples proving forced human presence over a long period. Then directly cross-referenced with Lucas Hargrove's medical records. Summoned forensic experts explained to the jury that the injuries to the wrists and ankles, the prolonged malnutrition, significant muscle mass loss, endocrine disruptions, and signs of complete light deprivation were entirely inconsistent with any mechanism of diving accident, disorientation, or short-term survival, but instead reflected a controlled, continuous, and organized process of detention. The prosecution continued by presenting the technical data collected during the investigation, including analysis of movement vehicles, the defendant's appearance and disappearance from the area, the temporal match between these activities, and the period of the victim's disappearance, as well as geographic traces showing the defendant's frequent access to the detention location. Lucas's testimony was presented cautiously, with the support of a psychologist, focusing on verifiable content, avoiding speculation, and not relying on seamless memory. In it, the victim confirmed having witnessed illegal activities beneath the lake and described the process of being subdued, transported, and detained in ways that aligned with what investigators had reconstructed from the scene. The jury evaluated this testimony, not on emotional grounds, but on its degree of compatibility with physical and forensic evidence, noting that although the victim's memory had gaps due to post-traumatic stress disorder, the core details matched independent findings. The defense focused on questioning the indirect nature of some evidence and the potential for memory distortion in the victim, arguing that there was no direct evidence recording the act of detention throughout the entire 5 months. However, these arguments were weakened when the prosecution demonstrated the interconnectedness of the evidence system, in which each individual element was cross-verified and collectively pointed toward a unified conclusion of intentional criminal conduct. The jury placed particular emphasis on the analysis of the modus operandi, determining that approaching the victim in an isolated area, rapid control, traceless transport, and prolonged detention without causing death demonstrated a high level of preparation, terrain knowledge, and victim psychological control, ruling out the possibility of impulsive or random behavior. During deliberations, the judges fully considered the defendant's level of danger to society, the long-term consequences to the victim's physical and mental health, as well as the need for general deterrence against serious violations of personal freedom. The verdict was announced publicly in court, finding Calvin Rourke guilty on the main charges and fully criminally liable under Nevada state law. The court sentenced him to 38 years in prison, with no early parole eligibility, emphasizing that this sentence accurately reflected the serious, intentional, and far-reaching nature of the criminal conduct, while ensuring the requirement to protect the community from the risk of recidivism. In explaining the verdict, the court affirmed that the sentence was based on a comprehensive weighing of physical evidence, medical conclusions, victim testimony, and legal analyses, without reliance on any single factor, and that the defendant's criminal responsibility had been established beyond a reasonable doubt. With the sentence taking effect, the trial process was deemed complete, marking the legal closure of the case, after a lengthy and complex proceeding in which objective truth had been clarified through a tight system of evidence and the court's judgment. After the sentence took effect, the long-term consequences of the case began to become clearly evident in the personal lives of the victim, his family, and the involved community. Starting first with Lucas Hargrove's firm decision to completely withdraw from the civilian diving profession he had been dedicated to for many years. Medical and psychological evaluations showed that returning to the diving environment, especially deep water areas, not only carried physical risks due to injuries that had not fully healed, but also posed the danger of triggering panic reactions and traumatic flashbacks, making the choice to abandon the profession a necessary self-protection measure rather than a mere occupational sacrifice. This decision led to profound changes in Lucas's economic life and personal identity, forcing him to reshape his future in the context of losing a career that had once been the center of his life before the incident occurred. Lucas's family also took a long-term protective step by changing their place of residence, leaving the area that had been tied to the disappearance and the investigation process, not only to avoid prolonged media attention, but also to create a new living space, separated from memories, constantly triggered by the old location. The relocation was assessed by psychological experts as an important supporting factor in the recovery process, helping the family reduce feelings of being watched, prolonged anxiety, and accumulated stress throughout the many years of waiting and trial. Alongside these changes in living environment, Lucas entered a long-term psychological treatment process, structured according to protocols for victims of prolonged detention and complex trauma, including individual therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, and interventions aimed at restoring emotional control, sleep, and memory. Treatment reports noted that although acute panic symptoms had gradually decreased after the trial, deeper psychological consequences, such as persistent feelings of insecurity, social avoidance, and difficulty re-establishing trust, continued to be present, requiring monitoring and support for many years. On a broader level, the case created a significant social impact within the local community and professional circles, particularly among groups working in isolated environments, such as divers, survey technicians, and personnel in remote areas. Public and professional discussions were organized to review personal safety procedures, missing contact alarm mechanisms, and the role of sharing risk information within the professional community, with Lucas's case regarded as a typical example of danger, not stemming from occupational accident, but from deliberate criminal behavior. At the same time, the case also contributed to raising social awareness about the long-term consequences of kidnapping and detention, not limited to the moment the victim is rescued, but extending over many years of post-trauma, affecting family, work, and the ability to reintegrate into the community. Institutionally, the case file was permanently archived in the judicial system and related investigative databases, with all physical evidence, forensic conclusions, medical records, and trial documents preserved according to regulations, serving both long-term legal purposes and becoming a reference source for research and professional training in the fields of criminal investigation and victim support. This archiving does not signify closure in terms of memory for those directly involved, but reflects how the legal system fully acknowledges the consequences of a criminal act that extends beyond the scope of the sentence, spreading into human lives and social structures. For Lucas and his family, the trial was not the end of the journey of endurance, but rather the boundary marking the transition from the phase of facing legal uncertainty to the phase of living with confirmed and named after effects, in which continued treatment, adaptation, and rebuilding of life became a long-term, quiet but no less heavy process, occurring in parallel with society. Remembering the case as a warning about the profound damage that deliberate violence leaves behind, even after justice has been served. At the present time, Lucas Hargrove's life unfolds in a state of marked withdrawal and clear separation from the social sphere he once belonged to before the incident occurred, with the choice to live in seclusion regarded as a self-protection mechanism rather than active avoidance. After leaving the diving profession and relocating with his family, Lucas maintains a minimalist rhythm of life, limiting social contact and avoiding environments that could trigger memories related to the period of detention, in which Lake Mead has become a place name he deliberately removes entirely from his personal life map. The decision not to return to the lake area stems not only from psychological factors, but also from medical assessments, indicating that re-entering deep water environments and familiar landscapes could reactivate latent panic responses and traumatic flashbacks. Lucas has also chosen not to publicly disclose the full extent of what he witnessed during his detention, even after the case concluded legally, partly because those memories remain intrusive and difficult to control, and partly because treatment specialists have determined that repeatedly reliving the details of the experience could cause serious long-term harm to the recovery process. The information already entered into the investigative and trial record is considered sufficient to establish the legal truth, while the remainder is kept as a personal boundary, where Lucas strives to maintain the final measure of control over his own life story. The personal aftermath of the case continues to manifest in many aspects of daily life, from difficulties maintaining stable sleep, unconscious avoidance reactions to sounds or images that evoke recall, to a persistent sense of insecurity even in environments considered safe. Treatment reports note that although Lucas has achieved a certain level of adaptation, the psychological aftereffects do not disappear completely, but shift into a low-grade simmering state, requiring ongoing monitoring and periodic intervention over many years. His family functions as a closed support structure, minimizing external intrusion to the greatest extent possible, with the goal of maintaining stability rather than seeking public attention or recognition. On the social level, Lucas does not participate in community advocacy activities or share his experience, as many other victims do, because his choice leans toward rebuilding life in silence, avoiding being continually defined by the role of victim in a case that once drew significant public interest. This renders his presence in the public sphere almost imperceptible, yet it reflects a personal recovery approach based on shrinking the surrounding world to better control destabilizing triggers. Legally, the case is confirmed to have concluded fully once the sentence against the perpetrator took effect, and no further proceedings remain pending, with the file permanently archived in the judicial system as a definitively resolved matter. This ending carries the meaning of establishing criminal responsibility and upholding the rule of law, but it does not equate to the human consequences being closed at the same moment. For Lucas, the present is not measured by milestones after the trial, but by the ability to maintain a fragile balance between a confirmed past and a future rebuilt in small steps. His life is not aimed at fully restoring the person he was before, but at learning to exist with new limitations, accepting that a part of himself was permanently changed by the period of detention. In his current state, Lucas does not seek a symbolic closure or a neat ending to his life story, but chooses a quiet continuation, where mere survival and the maintenance of daily stability are viewed as a form of personal victory, even if it remains unpublicized and unhonored, and where the case exists only as a closed file in the legal system, yet leaves a lasting imprint on the lives of those involved. The story of Lucas Hargrove directly reflects many issues that exist in contemporary American life, particularly the illusion of personal safety, the limits of society's protective systems, and the long-term cost of deliberate violence. Lucas was an experienced civilian diver working independently at Lake Mead, believing that skill, terrain knowledge, and personal preparation were sufficient to manage risk. This very belief, very common in American culture, that highly values self-reliance and individual capability, led him to operate alone, outside any official assignment, without oversight mechanisms, and thus become an easy target for isolation. The first lesson from the story is this: in modern society, the greatest risks do not always come from accidents, but from people with criminal motives, especially in spaces far removed from community and legal attention. The fact that Lucas was held for 5 months reveals another reality: the consequences of crime do not end when the victim returns. Medical records and psychological assessments in the story show prolonged malnutrition, physical injuries, and persistent PTSD that forced Lucas to abandon diving, relocate, and live in seclusion. This reminds American society that victim support cannot stop at investigation and trial. It requires long-term investment in mental health care, occupational reintegration, and protection of private life. Finally, Lucas's choice not to publicly disclose everything he witnessed is a lesson about respecting personal boundaries. In a society that mediatizes every tragedy, Not every victim has an obligation to recount their story to inspire or satisfy public curiosity. The practical lesson from this story is this: personal safety must be viewed as a collective responsibility. Justice is necessary, but not sufficient, and true recovery only begins when society learns to protect people before, during, and long after the crime occurs. If you believe stories like Lucas's need to be told to remind us of the fragility of personal safety and the value of justice, please subscribe to the channel to join us in the next cases. Thank you for watching until the very end, and see you in the next video, where we continue to dive deep into the hidden truths behind disappearances and haunting resurrections.